It's great to see you all here. It's great to see so many people here. We are delighted to welcome you to something new, a new venture that we're trying. So consider yourselves guinea pigs for the evening. One of the good things to have come out of the last year is the way that we are more easily working like this, using formats like Zoom to enable us to gather from large geographical areas in a way that we may not have been able to easily before. So primarily we're gathering from 5 districts today. We've got Sheffield District, Yorkshire West, Yorkshire North and East, Darlington and Newcastle districts, and one or two extras have snuck in. And it's great to have so many of you here. We didn't know whether we were going to expect 20 people or 200 at these events, so somewhere in the between is about right, I think. It's great to see some familiar faces. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carolyn Godfrey and I'm the Regional Safeguarding Officer. So I cover the Darlington District and the Newcastle District as their DSO. We also have with us tonight Katie Spencer-Madden, who is the DSO for Yorkshire North and East. And she'll be closing towards the end, and lurking quietly in the background is Alison Hill, the DSO for Sheffield, and we're grateful for all that she's done. We're also grateful for all the work that our admin and tech supporters have been giving us in the last few months in the build up to this and are giving us this evening. Just 1 or 2 points of housekeeping before we go any further. If you could remain on mute through the evening, unless you're in a breakout room, and then you are allowed to take yourself off mute and talk to each other. This just helps to prevent background noise and prevents echoey feedback and just keeps the sound clearer for everybody. We are going to be using breakout rooms for group discussions. We also have the chat function, which quite a number of you have already been using. And Tracy is going to be putting a link in the chat to another thing that we can be using to share feedback and ideas, but I'll let her explain that. So that watch out for the link for that in a few minutes. If you have a question, feel free to pop it into the chat, and the facilitators tonight will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be monitoring it. This is something new for us all, and we are all hoping that it will run smoothly. But thank you in advance for your patience if we have any hiccups. So we're hoping for a smooth running evening. We're going to start by just having a few moments of devotions. And I will start those by the Bible reading that's been behind our thinking since we first started talking about this way back in the autumn. It's been behind our thinking as we've planned this conference and as we've built up for this week. And this is from 1 Peter chapter 4. The end of all things is near. Therefore be serious and discipline yourself for the sake of your prayers. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. us pray. God of all, make the roof of our house wide enough for all opinions. Oil the door of our house so that it opens easily to friend and stranger. And set such a table in our house that we may speak kindly and freely. God, as we strive for success, for wealth, for stability, for status, turn our eyes from the top of the mountain that we may see to wash the feet of the world. For if we pray, we believe. If we believe, we love. And if we love, we will serve. Lord, help us to take good care of the paths between our houses, to use them to meet each other. For if they are not used, they will become overgrown with thistles and even harder to pass. Make us communities of love, strong enough to include others. Amen. I'm delighted to welcome Deacon Tracey Hume to join us this evening. To kick things off for us on this week of online events, as I said your name, Tracey, there's a big clap of thunder here. I don't know whether this is indicative of the evening or a sign, but yes. Tracey is the community engagement enabler in the Newcastle district. She has a lot of experience of community engagement, particularly with those who find themselves marginalised financially. She's initiated the Poverty Truth Commission in Gateshead, which is a mechanism to give those without a voice. For those who've lived the experience of poverty, an opportunity to be heard, and so they can be at the heart of change. Tracey also leads an online church for those in recovery from addiction. On Saturday, she ran an online day conference looking at what the church can learn from the 12-step programme for addiction recovery. Given all the work that must have gone into Saturday, we are particularly grateful for her willingness to join us tonight. Thank you, Tracey, and we look forward to what you're going to share with us. And I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, my headache from Saturday has just about disappeared, so I'm hoping we'll be okay. And I've caught up on the sleep that I missed last week worrying about it, so we're fine. Well, it's good evening. It's really good to share with you tonight. I feel like a bit like the guinea pig trying the first one, but hopefully we'll be fine. We're going to talk about aspects of community engagement and the gift of community, but especially over this last year with the pandemic. As Carolyn said, if you're feeling a little more adventurous than chat's fine. Use chat. If you feel a bit more adventurous, in the chat I put a link to something called Jamboard. So if you see like a link and it's got the word Jamboard in, that's it. It's basically a virtual post-it note board. So you can click on that, and then on the left hand side of the screen you'll find some post-it notes. You click on the post-it note and then drag it over to the screen, and then you can type what you fancy on your post-it note. And it's just a different way of doing it, a little bit more visual maybe, and I'm a visual learner, so that's why I use Jamboard. And we can keep them for afterwards, so we can keep the comments. So if you've got anything you want to say about what I'm saying, you can even disagree with me, that's absolutely fine. Then you could put it on the Jamboard or questions or in the chat. So some of you will know me, some of you might be wondering who I am and what I'm about. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. So I am a deacon, I have been since 2012. My first appointment was in Gateshead, south of the River Tyne. And in that appointment, I had two main churches. I had a Fresh Expression of Church in a soft play centre, and a more traditional congregation and building, but with a real heart to serve the community. And it was in this second context particularly where I grew in my understanding of what community was, the church's relationship with community, and how people were often marginalised, and the role of social justice within our work in communities. In 2019, after 7 years in that appointment, I was asked to build on that work in the circuit and to help to resource and challenge the churches and circuits around the whole of the district to engage more with their communities and explore new communities of church. So I was in that role for 6 months, just trying to discern how God was going to best use me in the role when COVID hit, and all my assumptions went out the window. And I had to reassess what my role might look like in a pandemic, but also for new ways to engage with community in that time. And as Carolyn said, I ended up by accident really gathering a group of addicts over lockdown who have become a simple church community that's growing. I would never have anticipated that. So today I don't share with you with years and years of academic research and experience. I just simply share some of my own learning and that over that time, and hopefully open up some conversations that you might find helpful. I'm going to suggest that I don't speak to you for an hour, thank goodness you say, but instead I'll look at 2 different aspects of community, and between each aspect we'll have some breakout room conversations. You get a break from my face and my voice, and you get to share some of your wisdom that's probably far greater than mine. So for the first part, I want to reflect a little on the COVID situation and how that's impacted on community engagement, what gifts these changes might have given us as a church, and maybe what legacy it will have. Then in the second part, after some conversation, we're going to look at where and who the marginalised communities are, and how the church might pay more attention to those voices as we come out of restrictions, and how we can engage with that safely. I'm going to ask some questions as I go. I'm not going to answer them all. They're just some of the questions that are going around my head at the moment, and maybe they're some of the same questions you're asking yourself, but maybe we can reflect on them together. I don't think there has ever been before a situation globally that has so obviously affected every single person in some way. We've had world wars, and we've obviously got, and we've had disease breakouts in the past, and we've got a global climate crisis that does affect everybody. We just don't all maybe realise it. But this has really impacted everybody in some way. But wherever you live in the world, it's affected you. We didn't see it coming. And actually, if we had been told on March the 23rd last year that a year later we would still be in some kind of lockdown for months to come, we would have said there is no way we can manage this. So sometimes it's a good job that we don't get the full picture, isn't it? So I want to highlight 5 of the things that have struck me during the last year about community engagement. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, it's just what we've got time for today. Now, as Chris Whitty does, I'm going to say next slide, please. So I'm going to go to the second slide, if that's okay. Move on, that's it, brilliant. So firstly, there was a better sense of community, and it was a gift of belonging. In that first lockdown back in March 2020, we knew that we had strict restrictions until the end of June. And we kind of got our heads around that, didn't we? People were generally pretty compliant, and there was a real almost wartime spirit at times. All over the country, people were popping notes through their neighbours' doors, offering practical help with collecting prescriptions and doing their shopping and so on. Community COVID relief social media groups were established to try and coordinate that regional help. And churches, which had already been involved with community or community support, such as food banks, ramped up their efforts. Some churches who were used to supporting local vulnerable people with folks coming onto the premises started finding new ways to support these folk, sometimes through delivering hot meals, phone calls, doorstep check-ins, and so on. Many churches learned that many of their existing volunteers were in the vulnerable category in lockdown. So now they weren't able to use the same volunteers, and they had to find new ones. Clap for carers at 8 p.m. on a Thursday. Also added to the community spirit, didn't it? Some people reported how they had spoken to their neighbours for the first time during this, or began to get to know them by name rather than a just quick wave. There was a collective cause which we all identified with, and it drew us together. For me, pre-COVID, there were pockets of great community around the country, but society and the media and other influences were increasingly encouraging a narrative to look after number one. Improve yourself, protect yourself, do what is good for you. And Brexit just seemed to exacerbate some of those prejudices in communities and that sense of them and us. And in many ways, our country felt, I think for me anyway, more fragmented before COVID than it had done in a very long time. And I was beginning to really quite fear for the future, if I'm honest. So what happened in those first few months of lockdown was a fresh reminder that community hadn't died, that in a crisis, we know how to come together. I found it quite reassuring and maybe quite emotional as well, seeing and hearing how communities were responding and how the church was at the heart of it. I don't know about you, but I'm really hoping that as we begin to return to our busy daily lives, that we don't lose some of that improvement in community cohesiveness and looking out for our neighbour. It's what our churches have been talking about for centuries. Love your neighbour. But it took a pandemic for people to begin to notice those who live next door. So as we move forward, how might the church help to maintain some of that gift of community identity and continue to model it and build on it? So that's one of those questions I'm not necessarily going to answer, but you might want to have a think about. Next slide, please. Churches working with others, the gift of partnership. One of the things that churches have sometimes been used to doing is working in silo, maybe seeing a need and trying to do something themselves about it, or having a good idea and running with it. But during COVID, there was so much increased need that churches often found themselves working with others for the first time because they wouldn't be able to do it on their own. There was an increase of churches working ecumenically and with other faith groups, or of liaising with local councils and fair shares and supermarkets and charities and so on. It's so that that need could be met in the most efficient way possible and to try and ensure that no one slipped through the cracks of support. This kind of working together is vital in community support and transformation. During COVID, there's been an acceptance by church groups that they can't do it alone. And I think that's a good thing. Partnership allows for others to really join in, to bring their gifts, their assets, so the provision is more whole. In my work in Blaydon, I learned that quite early on. As a local church, what we had was a good sized building, some storage and some volunteers with good hearts. What we didn't have was expertise. And so instead of setting up our own food bank, we worked with another in Gateshead and became a satellite bank. And in working with the council and associated groups, we were offered CAB support for clients and a weekly expert to come in and advise clients on housing and benefits. A local allotment group began to offer spare fruit and veg so that we could give fresh food as well as packaged. Over the summer, we were given money by the council towards the Make Lunch provision for children. Support with a community garden became a possibility to provide the chance for locals to grow their own vegetables for themselves and use gardening as a way of improving mental health. Then the local community heard more about what we were doing as we updated them on Facebook, and the offers for help with food, sanitary products, toiletries and so on came in. There was a noticeable change in attitude by local people from seeing people as scroungers, which they picked up from the media often, to this could be me. And during COVID, I think that has been one of the big realizations of people with insecure jobs and so on, making more people aware that we're all vulnerable, we're all potentially vulnerable. The more we worked with others when we were at Blaydon, the greater the awareness of the issues became, and the more people could be helped. But more than that, it became a more carefully planned provision, which also began to address some of the reasons why people were in that boat in the first place. So my prayer is that as a result of this pandemic, churches will be much more willing to be open to working with others in partnership for the benefit of the whole community and resist some of that silo working. Next slide, please. We said thank you more often, the gift of gratitude. This might seem a strange observation, but one of the things that happened in the first few months that I felt was notable was that people began to notice those who were making a difference in our communities, who we couldn't manage without. The term key worker became a thing. Refuse collectors were grouped with nurses and shopkeepers, and posties with doctors, and all of a sudden there was a shift. And I tried to build on this at the time and launched a hashtag Essential Heroes, encouraging people to put thank you notes and cards and sweets and things on their bins for refuse collectors, notes on post boxes for posties, cards and sweets for shop workers, all sanitised of course, as well as thanking the NHS. And every Thursday evening for months, we gathered on our doorsteps to thank NHS staff and care workers by clapping as a community. There was really amazing community feel to our streets around the country as we kept coming together to thank people and encourage them to keep going in the unbearable challenges of dealing with the front line of the pandemic. How it must have felt for an NHS or a care worker to know that the whole country had your back and were urging you on and thanking you. Some people even made PPE and uniform laundry bags for medical staff. We pulled together. So we might ask ourselves, why did it take a pandemic to make us appreciate people around us and their contribution? How can we learn from this and become a more thankful community? Again, when I worked in Blaydon, I was really concerned about the Brexit sense of communities being more broken and segregated, and a real focus on everything being negative. So we decided to run a positive event which would hopefully get people to look for the good in one another instead. So we came up with the idea of Blaydon Angels. We approached the local MP too and asked if she would be interested in partnering with us on it, and she was delighted. We put a notice out on social media and local notice boards for people to nominate someone in the Blaydon area for a Blaydon Angel Award, either because they needed an angel after a really tough time or because they'd been an angel to other people in some way. And we got over 30 nominations, which for big and small acts of kindness, people who'd worked to support the community behind the scenes, or had just simply been there for other people in their dark days. And in the run up to Christmas, we held an afternoon where we invited all the people nominated and their nominators, as well as the MP and a few others. And all those who were nominated won a large knitted angel and a framed citation saying why they'd been nominated and to thank them for being an angel. And this seemed to really resonate with the community, and there was a really positive feel around. This last year, the MP decided that she would continue with that event and do COVID Angels, thanking people all around the community who had helped others in different ways during the pandemic. And I love the fact that the local church were modelling positivity, thanking people and valuing people's contributions. So how can we continue to notice and appreciate the treasures in every community from now on? And how can churches help to maintain that culture of reflecting that sense that all people are treasures and have value to God? Next slide. Poverty became more obvious, the gift of seeing. Many of us who work in churches and local communities are aware of many of those who find themselves in financial poverty at different times and the challenges which come from being in that situation. But during the pandemic, not only have we become aware of the reality faced by so many more people, but people learned the reality of what it was like to not know how they were going to pay their bills. We became more aware of the number of people who worked in vulnerable economies such as the gig economy, bar work, 0-hour contracts, and so on. People who had had secure jobs also struggled to manage financially when wages were reduced by 80% to 80% on furlough. The demand for food banks in October to December last year alone rose by 61%, with one parcel being given out every 6 minutes. In the first wave, around 50% of the people accessing food banks had never used one before. These are staggering numbers, aren't they? I think many people have woken up to the extent of poverty in this country and just how vulnerable so many people are to potentially being in poverty. So I hope some attitudes towards those who find themselves having to use food banks has changed too as a result. Maybe there's going to be less judgment. I hope so. As Jesus said, we will always have the poor among us. But what COVID has done is shine a very bright light on so many issues. Of course, early on in the first lockdown, universal credit was raised by £20 per week. This was a good thing, but it also made many people who'd previously been accessing universal credit before COVID angry. Why was the old amount enough for them to supposedly live on? But when more middle class people needed to go on universal credit, it wasn't considered enough and was upped. So there was a sense of historical injustice that a value judgment was made about the people who were on benefits before COVID to those who were on them as a result of COVID. With homeschooling, internet and technology poverty became more apparent as families struggled to enable their children to join lessons online or people to work online. Fuel poverty became a particular issue during the winter as children were at home all day and people weren't at work and the temperatures were really low. So heating had to be on more and people struggled to keep up with their fuel bills. Make lunch and holiday hunger provisions have been around for about 8 or 9 years now, and many churches have often led the way in this. But during the pandemic, the numbers of children needing to access extra help rose significantly. In this academic year alone, there have been 1 million new applications for free school meals. And it was reported that more than 200,000 children had to skip a meal due to lack of money at home during COVID. And Marcus Rashford and others highlighted this need, but it has always been there. But the gift of seeing in COVID, we maybe need to make the most of. 1 in 4 parents of children skip meals because of lack of money in a report in January 2018. That was before the pandemic. 1 in 4 parents. Poverty levels were high anyway, but much of the statistics were hidden under metaphorical carpets. So how can the church help to keep these issues and situations in the public consciousness and also lobby and fight for justice where we encounter it in the lives of those in our communities? So I hope that the pandemic will open our eyes more to the existing and newly found issues of poverty in our communities and give us the courage to seek justice. Next slide, please. Marginalization and inequalities became more apparent, the gift of knowledge and awareness. As with financial poverty, marginalization and inequality have been happening forever in our country and communities, but COVID has again shone a light on some of those inequalities. We know that people who lived in financially marginalized communities were at greater risk of catching COVID. People of Bangladeshi ethnicity had around twice the risk of death from COVID compared to people of white British ethnicity. People of Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, Caribbean, and other Asian and Black ethnicities had between 10 and 50% higher risk of death. We know that the reasons for that are complicated, but one of the obvious reasons is that people of Bangladeshi, Asian, and other Black ethnic groups are more likely to be found in jobs where the risk is higher for catching it. They are more likely to be in low-paid care work, transport jobs, cleaning roles, and so on. They're also more likely to be in overcrowded and poor accommodation. During the summer of 2020, we were also hit by headlines from America and this country, which demonstrated unequal treatment of Black people by the police. Black Lives Matter movement grew significantly because of these headlines. These are not new issues. But how, as we move forward from this pandemic, do we ensure that poverty and issues of inequality are addressed? And as churches, how do we take lead on that? I really hope and pray that there will be a positive legacy from COVID for our churches, our community groups, individuals and governments working together to address the balance and addressing the inequalities for so many people. That churches particularly will work towards and fight for a radically inclusive community and educate themselves and the experiences of others who've been affected by inequality. How can we use some of those 5 gifts that I've mentioned today and many more that I'm sure we can come up with? So I really could go on about what I've seen during this last year, and as you can tell, I can talk for England, but I want to give you the chance to reflect on some of these things yourselves. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, probably for about 10 minutes or so, I think. And I'm going to invite you to think about these 2 questions. What have you noticed in your community during the pandemic? And what inequalities have you become aware of in the last year or so? Your experiences will be different to mine. Your community is different to ones I've been engaged in, and you will probably be more insightful than me as well. So I'm keen to hear about it. If your conversation goes in a slightly different direction, you have a more general conversation about what we might have learned, that's absolutely fine. But these are sort of starters for 10. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes or so in the breakout rooms, and then hopefully we can have about 5 minutes to feedback from a couple of the groups before we move on to the next bit. Okay, is that all right? I think we're all back, aren't we? I hope you had some fruitful conversations. We've just got sort of 5 minutes, so we could just do a little bit of feedback. So if anybody wants to feedback something that was discussed in their group, for everybody to hear, felt that would be helpful. If you use the raise hand function, which on my screen, if you go onto reactions, then raised hand is there, then you will automatically come up at the top of our screen, so we'll know to ask you. It's easier when there's lots and lots of screens of people, if you can click the raise hand function. Right, so we've got Rach Ward. Rach, would you like to share? If you'll have to unmute yourself to share.
I just thought I'd go first. So
yeah, that's great. Don't like the silence, like a person to be willing to go first.
I was hoping somebody else might have got in first. We talked about a lack of, one of the things we noticed in our churches was a lack of volunteers that were available, because so many of our congregation were over the age of 70 in that first breakout particularly. So we might have had buildings to offer, we may even have had finances to offer, but we didn't necessarily have people. We talked about the loneliness that a lot of people have experienced, and drawing out from that some of the inequalities of IT, obviously within the schools, but we also recognised a significant proportion of our church communities who have engaged with IT, who perhaps wouldn't have done, and have brought their own adult children along in order to help them set up to watch a Zoom service, that kind of idea. And we also then talked about financial inequalities, relating that to the life of the churches, and thinking that it's the churches that had a lot of lettings that will be hit financially, and that there is sometimes a reluctance to share our finances across churches, and also a fear that when we come through lockdown, churches might want to push to do money raising schemes. Some might need to, but some might just be wanting to refill reserves. That's a bit of a broad brushstroke, but
no, that's great. Got lots of things there. That's absolutely great. I think actually the church lettings thing and churches being reliant on that stuff is actually probably something we need to learn from, because that's not sustainable long term. But that's really helpful. Thank you. Joan Carr, I think you've got your hand up there. Can you unmute yourself, Joan? And you should come up on my screen. There you go. We can see you.
Actually, it's not really to say about what our group talked about, but it's just a quickie in talking about volunteers. I'm 78, and we got at the beginning of the first lockdown a message around our homes about joining a group of people who would go visit elderly people and help them out with stop training. So I happily volunteered for this, and was told by the lady that I'm awfully sorry, you can't do it, you're too old.
Oh, how sad. when the spirit is willing and they're telling you the body's too old, that's really not good, is it? It was to keep you safe though, wasn't it? But hopefully you'll be able to get back up and volunteer in it once. Now you've had your jabs, we'll get you out again.
Well, I have actually kept doing it. I've just finished off my own batch with various people that I know and taken them worship resources down to people every week.
Yeah.
Like that. So I've just carried on doing it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Anybody else? We'll just maybe got time for one more feedback before we move on. Sean.
Hi, thank you. I think the thing that was just coming to the fore at the end of our conversation was the point you made about universal credit. We know a lot of what you said had resonated with us, and we recognize it was like holding a mirror up to our situations. So thank you for that, Tracey. But it was that point about universal credit and the injustice there that particularly struck home. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. I'm going to be talking about the Poverty Truth Commission in a few moments, and that was one of the things that came out for them, because most of those had been on universal credit before, and that was where that injustice came out. So yeah, thank you. So we will have some more breakout room time in a little while. We're just going to move on to the next thing. So if we could screen share the PowerPoint again, that would be helpful. Thank you. I'm going to the next slide. So this is what I'm calling it. Oh, go back one. Sorry, I thought I had a thing on it, but I didn't. So the gift of listening, I'm going to call this. For this section, I want to focus more on how we can listen better to those who find themselves marginalised for different reasons, but especially those who find themselves financially marginalised. And to do that, I want to share some of my experiences of helping to establish the Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission. And that's why I've called it the gift of listening. Listening is the foundation stone and principle for all our community engagement. If we fail to listen, we fail to value those we seek to serve. I'm a chatterbox, as I said, people have worked that out today already. But listening is not always easy for me. I would rather be talking. But in my work over the last 9 years, I've learned that listening is vital. When I take time to listen and take notice of what's happening around me, I learn so much and begin to see where God is at work. For those who watched Call the Midwife last night, one of the nuns very beautifully said, "We learn best when we listen to others." I hear issues I've never even thought about when I listen, but the best listening happens in relationship. When we take the time to get to know someone and hear their story, we not only learn, but we can also be transformed. There is also something about moving away from seeing people we try to serve as clients or issues to be solved, and moving towards seeing them as guests who have as much to teach us and are assets to be treasured. I can honestly say that when I was regularly volunteering at the food bank in Blaydon, I learned so much from the folks I encountered, and I saw some of the most incredible resilience, honesty, courage, and insight. But it was in those early days of my volunteering that I was unsettled. As the numbers of those who needed to access the food bank rose, I asked myself lots of questions, like, why are they here? What is wrong with the system which leads folk to need to resort to a food bank? And I moved from the giving of the food, so I wasn't doing the packages so much. I decided I wanted to do the sitting and listening at the tables. I wanted to hear their stories. And after a while of hearing these stories, I started to get really angry. These people were often here through no fault of their own, but because of faults and inflexibilities of the benefit system. And I wanted to keep providing that practical help, but I wanted to shout about why they were there in the first place. I had a real passion in my gut by then. So I came across this quote from Martin Luther King at the time, and it really hit me. So that's what's on the next slide. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that a system that produces beggars needs to be repaired. We are called to be the Good Samaritan. But after you have lifted so many people out of the ditch, you start to ask, maybe the whole road to Jericho needs to be repaired. I love that. So I began to preach about some of the reasons in the churches that I'd heard about and the circuit, and I saw some transformed opinions, but that wasn't enough. One of the big reasons for food bank access in those early days was benefit sanctions. People having their benefits stopped with immediate effect for between 2 and 3 months, usually because they were late for an appointment or could not face an appointment because of their mental or physical health. I also had one of the regulars trying to take her life because she could not face more sanctions. If you read the BBC News website today or watched the news, you will have seen there's a similar story today, which shows this is still a current issue. So if we can have the next slide. So I started a t-shirt campaign. Oh, sorry, it'll be the next one. I keep forgetting I put in a holding slide. I started a t-shirt campaign alongside Jay Pitt's Rethink Sanctions to highlight the issue. And 40 of us, including some of those who'd had to access the food bank, handcuffed ourselves to my church railings to highlight people being locked into poverty because of these sanction decisions. It got a lot of press attention, which was great, and the local DWP office began to make contact to chat about how they could improve their service. So that was good. There was a little bit of change, but it still felt uncomfortable. I didn't want to simply interpret the voices of those in poverty to other people. I wanted their voices to be heard. It was hearing their stories firsthand that transformed me, and I wanted that as well for others. And that's when I heard about the Poverty Truth Commission. So we go to the next slide. And again, sorry. Poverty Truth Commissions are amazing. They use the post-apartheid slogan of nothing about us, without us is for us. The understanding that no lasting social change can happen unless the people who are most affected by the policies are at the heart of the conversations to change them. Seems simple, but it's not the way things work normally. It's quite a long process. It can take 1 to 2 years from when you start it. But in short, they first involve gathering people with lived experience of poverty and helping them to find the best way to tell their story and have a sense of community together. Then the stories are heard by civic and business leaders, and then those leaders are invited to work with the people with lived experience and try and work together for change. Now, I'm not going to pretend that setting up a Poverty Truth Commission up in Gateshead was easy or quick. It took time to build relationships with those who were experiencing poverty, and also the agencies who were often policymakers influencing people's experiences. We had to gain trust, and that took a few years. But in 2018, we felt ready, and we had the support of the local council. We appointed a poverty truth lead in Lucy Slavinska, and she and I worked together on establishing it. We gathered a group of people we called community commissioners. These were people from all around Gateshead who had experienced poverty in different ways and were willing to join us in trying to work towards change. We met with them monthly to build a sense of community and to find the best way for each of them to tell their story. Some used poetry, some were happy to tell their story from a microphone, others used art, others video. In March 2020, we invited over 100 civic and business leaders from Gateshead to come and hear the stories. We held the event in the council chamber of the Civic Centre in Gateshead, the place where decisions were normally made about them. Instead, on that day, they were stood in the seat of power, telling their truths that needed to be heard. So I'm going to play a video now of one of the commissioners telling her story. This is how she told it at the commission. So she was asked to draw a picture of herself, an avatar, and it was animated by an organisation for us so that she could maintain some of her anonymity. So I'm going to screenshot. I'm going to have to quickly there we go. I'm going to have to quickly find it because it kept disappearing. I don't want a green screen. I want that. Right. Just find Marie. Okay, there we go. Right. I'm just going to get it on a little bit because the music goes on longer than needed.
Hi, I'm Marie. I'm a mum and a grandma to 9 grandchildren and 4 who live with me. I brought up my 4 children in Newcastle all by myself. They were hard times. As long as you had a bag of tatties, eggs and bread, a tin of corned beef if you can afford it, I could feed my kids. I was lucky. I had some support from my family. Not everyone did. I come to Gateshead about 18 years ago and it felt like a move forward. Unfortunately, my partner at the time didn't pay the mortgage like he said he would, and in the end I lost my family home. After that I found a private rent somewhere, but the landlord wanted me out. He tried a few nasty tricks to evict me. After that we ended up in a really damp house and the landlord won't do anything about it. One of my daughters had mental health problems. She had a daughter taken off her by social services. Social services told me if I didn't take her, she'd end up in a home. I took her in. About this time, my other daughters were suffering from domestic violence and ran away to Swansea. Unfortunately, she moved in with someone who was known to social services and she had her daughter taken into care. After this, my daughter come back to the northeast and got pregnant again. She kept this baby. About a year later, she had another child. She moved again and she had another baby. After one of her other children got taken to hospital, she wasn't allowed to take her home. I was looking after the other 2 kids, and a few days later, social services brought her other daughter to me. So now I was looking after 4 of my grandchildren. I couldn't have my grandkids in the damp house. I had to fight hard for a council house. It took a while and I had to speak to my local MP before I was finally rehoused. It was difficult looking after a baby and my other grandchildren. One social worker left, another one lost the paperwork. It was a mess. I had to make regular hospital visits with my granddaughter. It was very expensive. I remember at Christmas, I had no money for my other grandkids. I had to get a food voucher from the local church. I felt terrible, embarrassed. I felt degraded. I couldn't put food on the table for the bairns. After another fight, help from my MP again, I got some money through. None for looking after my grandkids. If I'd been a foster carer, I'd been paid enough money to live on. As the grandmother, I got nothing. Even though I got some money for one of my grandchildren, I get nothing for the other 3. It makes no sense to me. Lucky for me, my local church is very supportive and help with my transport expenses, food vouchers and toys for the kids. They even did my shopping when I was in hospital. I've always been a helpful person in my community. I always look out for people who might be struggling, take them underneath my wing and help them in any way I can. Things have got so much worse in the community in the last few years. We lost the community centre, short-staffed baby clinic and youth work stopped. All these cutbacks left our village in a much worse place. I think social services, they need to listen to parents more, especially help grandparents who need to look after their grandkids. People with mental health problems need more support in the community and a place to talk to people. We need money for youth workers to help the kids avoid drugs and trouble. Our community is trying to improve things. We've started lots of projects to brighten up the village. Getting involved with this type of work has been great for me. Improves, we can build something from nothing.
So the impact of Marie's story, I don't know how it made you feel, but the impact of her telling that story via that video on the launch event was quite incredible. And so many of the civic and business leaders shared after what an impact the stories like hers had had. The poverty lead for the council ended up leaving the room in tears after hearing her story. Suddenly things were different. So we spent some time after we'd done the launch event discerning which civic and business leaders we would invite to come and join us in working together on some changes. And everyone we approached said yes, and we went for the top dogs where we could. Our commission is now made up of community testifiers, and then the civic are made up of the deputy leader of Gateshead Council, the poverty lead for the council, the regional manager for the DWP, a representative from the banking industry in the region, the manager of Gateshead Housing, the local national lottery coordinator, the deputy director of public health for Gateshead. The director had other things to do with COVID, bless her, she wanted to join in. And we also have a national researcher into poverty who sits on the government's COBRA committee and works with Marcus Rashford on his campaign. So we've been meeting on Zoom for 7 months, rehearing the stories and sharing how they made us feel and identifying the emerging themes, and more importantly, getting to know each other as human beings on an equal footing. From this month, we've now started to work in 3 task groups, one on benefits and finance, including the frustrations of a job seeker, one on families and caring, which includes the kinship care like Marie had, housing issues and children with disabilities, and finally community resources such as community centres and provision for young people. These were the themes they identified they wanted to work on. Working together with everyone as an equal partner, all titles are left at the door. We hope to find some ways forward to change the experiences of those living in poverty for the better. We've also seen transformation of the civic and business leaders as they've got to know the community commissioners, seeing as them as real people rather than stories, rather than issues and statistics. The community commissioners have grown in confidence. It's a joy to see, and experience and sense of value. In November, the Gateshead Council were asked for to give a couple of people they could talk to about COVID policies and the impact. Every other region sent a top dog. Gateshead Council sent the Poverty Truth Commission. So they were talking to Government Cabinet Office, and I can tell you they were honest as the day is. They were brilliant. But they're going to get invited down to Parliament by the MP as well to go and talk at a national level. We have no idea what the outcomes of the commission will be, but we know that everyone involved has already been changed by the experience. I can honestly say that in all my working life, not just in ministry, this Poverty Truth Commission feels like the most important work I have ever been involved with, because it moves towards lasting social change rather than sticky plasters. And I'm reminded of a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He says, We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice, but we are to drive a spoke in the wheel itself. This feels like the Christ-like thing to do. Jesus taught us the need for justice seeking and our responsibility to shine a light on injustice whenever we see it and to challenge it. The Poverty Truth Commission provides one way to do that, where the voices of the most marginalised are heard and valued. It also means a shift in attitude from the church feeling like they have to have or be the answer to everything, to instead working in partnership with others and using the gifts that they bring. Leading the Poverty Truth Commission has been a challenge at times. Working with vulnerable people week in, week out means that we have to constantly be alert to their mental health issues and to ensure that we don't abuse their honesty and their willingness, to keep the potential power dynamics in check. We decided at the outset we would create a risk assessment and try and preempt some of the issues of working with these wonderful folk, and also how to manage the full commission meeting so everybody was safe. We also ensured that we had a person who was not a facilitator to be available outside the meetings to give some of the food bank referrals and things like that, so that they could have a bit of dignity, that where they were being empowered with us and they could get the practical help elsewhere. And it meant we didn't have dual roles either. Keeping everyone safe in this process is vital if we're going to maintain respect and dignity and safety for all. It also means that we can be more productive because the mutual safety and care are in place. Not every church is going to be able to establish a Poverty Truth Commission, I know that. But in telling you the story of our commission, I wanted to highlight the importance of listening to those who find themselves in poverty. As we come out of COVID restrictions and begin to migrate back to our church buildings, how might we capture some of the stories and the experiences that people have had in the last year or so? How can we hear voices that we don't normally hear? Are we willing to be challenged by what we hear and work together to see communities and individuals transformed? The Poverty Truth Commission model is about equal voices and partnership. As churches, we can maybe have a tendency to do to rather than with. Are there lessons we can learn about doing things together and doing so safely? So we haven't got long, but we maybe just go into breakout rooms for 5-10 minutes. And just wonder if there was anything that has struck you about the process of the Poverty Truth Commission. How can we offer the gift of listening in our local community and not just to our congregations? And how do we do this safely? So we're going to do that about 10 minutes, and then we'll probably just have a Q&A or something at the end. I'll be led by our leaders and time because we're at 10 past already. Okay. Welcome back. So we've got just a couple of minutes before Katie's going to lead us at the end there. So we're just got a few minutes. If anybody has anything they really think is really helpful for other people to hear about what came out of your conversations, maybe particularly with this week and a focus about some safeguarding stuff as well, if there are things about how we ensure that things are done safely. But if there was something that just came out of your conversation about listening, that would be good too. Anybody going to put their hand up and risk going? If not, I'll just hand over to Katie, and that's fine because I don't have to answer any questions. Oh, there we go, Yvonne. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Well, I think God's trying to tell me something about listening, because I was on a training video this morning about suicide awareness, and there was a great emphasis on listening. And like you, I love to talk. So I think it's really, really important. And I think people need to feel listened to. And I think, you know, we underestimate it. If people feel valued, if we listen, and often we're too busy thinking what we're going to say next, how we're going to, well, what we're going to do and how we're going to say it. So I think that for me was a key point today.
Thank you. Actually, it's interesting with my work with people in the 12-step community that if you ever sit in a 12-step rooms, you will never know listening like it, because people get to be listened to and nobody is allowed to interrupt. Nobody's allowed to speak over them or offer advice. They just listen. And it is a really weird experience because we never receive it in society, very rarely. So yeah. Lydia, do you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, there's something really bold and permission giving about reflective practice. So let's try new uncomfortable things, and better yet, if they aren't working, let's stop doing them so we can be free to find something else that might work even better.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks Lydia, that's really helpful. Rach, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just to feedback from our group again, that we had a really good conversation about what makes us uniquely different as a church, and how we make those steps, that we're not just like another community group, but we recognize what we can offer uniquely through Christ, but also recognizing that in the context that you described to us, how we really saw God's Spirit moving and breaking down barriers in order to open up those conversations with people who had the power and influence to change. And I think I'm really encouraged by that the Spirit of God goes before us, and we shouldn't be afraid. So that was something for me that spoke very powerfully about where Christ was at work in that piece of work. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to see the change in the civic and business leaders, particularly in this process, and how important it is. But that's why it took so long to build the trust of those agencies before we could launch into this. But actually now the church is seen to be modeling something and taking a lead on, you know, seeking justice and change. And I just think that's incredible. I know somebody's asked a question in the chat about Church Action on Poverty rep. Yeah, we have somebody from the Northeast Church Action on Poverty group who's on the steering group, and one of the facilitators with us in the Poverty Truth Commission. And I've spoken at the Church Action on Poverty, and they kind of feed backwards and forwards. So yeah, we keep in touch with them, and we've kept in touch with Citizens Gateshead as well, who are doing something slightly different. But yeah, it's been a real gift to do it, I have to say, a real life-changing thing for me. So I think our time is gone. So shall I hand over to you, Katie? And everybody can be released from my voice. Thank you.
Thank you. A few people were commenting and wondering whether they could have the prayer that Carolyn used at the beginning. It was put in the chat. I don't know whether you've been able to copy that off, but we can always email it out to you later on. Just wanted to offer some words of thanks before we all go our separate ways and enjoy the rest of our evenings. Much thanks to our district safeguarding officers and our tech team for facilitating this evening, and everything seems to have gone very smoothly. There's always that nervousness about doing something virtually and whether something's going to go wrong with somebody's internet or something like that, but everything seems to have gone smoothly so far. We've had a big team of people working behind the scenes to put this virtual safeguarding conference together, all exercising their giftings and their various ministries to pull everything together. And for that, we are really appreciative and grateful of everybody who's been involved. This is the first session in a week's worth of sessions that we've got planned this week. And it's always incredibly difficult to go first, but Tracey, what a wonderful way to start us off. It has been fantastic this evening, and we are so appreciative of not only the time that you've given this evening, but in all the planning and preparation that has gone into the evening session as well. We are extremely appreciative of your ability to prompt and guide our thoughts around community and reflections upon the impact that COVID has had upon our communities. And it's so poignant at the moment, having had over a year now where our perceptions of what community is have been completely challenged, and those comfort zones that we've created have almost been eradicated in many ways. And for some people, they've really adapted, and for some churches and individuals, they've started to engage and connect with their communities in new and different and wondrous and creative ways. And some of the ones that you mentioned earlier this evening were truly wonderful, and we've seen great examples of that across our districts. But for some people, we recognise they have felt completely disengaged from their communities and have really struggled to connect. And for some people, it has been a real challenge, and they felt completely lost within everything what's going on at the moment. Tracey, you've given us some real food for thought this evening about how we as churches can move forward in connecting with our communities by listening, by increasing our awareness and our understanding of the issues, by working together, by getting to know one another with complete genuineness. And I think some of the things that we've heard this evening will really challenge and inspire us to reflect further about how we can use these things within our own ministries and as churches as well. If any of you here this evening have any questions about safeguarding and how that might integrate into some of the new outreach projects or ideas that your church might be thinking of engaging with, then please do contact your district safeguarding officer, who will be more than happy to provide you with any advice. So as we are about to leave, and luckily we don't have to travel very far, let's just spend a few moments in a time of prayer. Let us just be still, just for a moment, and be quiet. Let us just recall something from this evening that has provoked your thoughts, that you want to lift to God in prayer. Lord, we pray that your church will not only nurture those within our church buildings and congregations, but we will learn to reach out, to engage with those who may be longing to know, or those that are yet to know or experience your grace. As we find our communities changing and diversifying, particularly following the impact of COVID, may you, Lord, be at the centre of all we do and all we are, going before us as our guiding light to show us the way. And a blessing for this evening. Holy Spirit, please encircle us. Come hold us safe and secure this night. Wrap up our minds with your truth. Guide our thoughts and calm. Steady our emotions, Lord, that you would guide our feelings. Sustain our soul with vision for the future and hope for tomorrow. Amen. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'm sure we'll see some of you at the other sessions that we've got planned throughout the rest of the week. But have a good evening and good night to all of you, and God bless.